There is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing at all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that will lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of the comfort zone. Welcome to the conversation. So today I want to talk about tribes. Now, tribes have existed throughout human history. They exist in our work. They exist in our private communities. They exist all over the world. It's just a fact of human behavior. Sometimes they actually are a force for good, and sometimes they don't feel like a particularly strong force for good. So what we want to focus on is what is driving tribes? What are the underlying factors that make them so powerful? And with that knowledge, I want to begin to say, how do you use tribes to drive change, to change culture, and to create the kind of organizations that are going to have a constructive force? It's constructive impact. My guest today is Michael Morris. He's a cultural psychologist at Columbia University, and he's taught in a variety of different places. But the book that we're talking about today is his last, Tribal: How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Bring Us Together. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I really like the premise for the Out of the Comfort Zone podcast. I think it really recognizes what emerging leaders need, and it's very akin to some of the things that we try to teach at Columbia Business School.
Right. All right. I am super keen on this whole notion of emerging leaders because I think we are spending too little time on our mid-level leaders who are struggling with so many forces and so many demands. I'm sorry, it's my personal soapbox at the moment. So there we go one more time. All right. But let's talk about your book, because that's the really important part here, which is tribes. So why? What is it that got your attention about tribes?
Well, I've been meditating on this book for quite some time. I have been a researcher and a business school professor, as I know you were yourself. And so I have not only been trying to, make discoveries in the way that a behavioral scientist can, but then find ways to share those discoveries with the practical people of the world, to help them, get work done through other people, the essence of leadership. So I started with the idea of, let me write a playbook for leaders who recognize that there are cultures, whether it's the culture of the engineers as opposed to the salespeople, these professional cultures, or the corporate culture is one that no longer serves the current strategy, or it's a diverse organization and you have national cultures or religious cultures or ethnic cultures. So how can we understand the levers of cultural forces so that culture doesn't have to be an obstacle to what we're trying to accomplish? We can make it into an opportunity. We can, we can leverage culture and harness it. So that was my notion, and I had been making notes for the book, for almost a decade. But then the idea for the book changed a little bit around November 2016. I was finishing like a year-long process of working very closely with Hillary Clinton's election team. And I had previously worked on a small team of behavioral scientists, including some Nobel Prize winners who are much more famous than myself. But we're sort of like a Noah's Ark, people from all the different academic disciplines that might be helpful, whether political science or economics or psychology in my case. And I thought, well, this is going to be another victory for behavioral science and cultural psychology. We helped the first African American get elected president. Now, surely the first woman will be elected president. It certainly looked that way. And everyone I knew, living on the Upper West Side of New York and working in Democratic circles, felt like, if anything, it was going to be a landslide, maybe too much of a landslide even. There were all sorts of crazy ideas of like, maybe we should pump the brakes a little because it's, we don't want the Republicans to be humiliated. That was the way the people around me were thinking. And the election night celebration, a lot of thought went into it, and it was held at the Javits Convention Center in Manhattan, which is on the far west side of Manhattan near the Hudson River. And it was chosen because it has a literally a glass ceiling. It has a sort of glass roof so you can kind of see the stars. And so it was thought to be metaphorically appropriate. And I was so excited, and I, went, and, you know, there are all these rings of the event, people outdoors looking at big screens, and then people who had a ticket to get into the lobby, and then people who had a ticket to get into the VIP area, then the people, who are actually working on the campaign. So it was like this sense of going into the inner sanctum, and then, early on in the night, it was all, glasses of champagne and, high fives and congratulations, because we would see, California, Oregon, we see states like that turning blue. And then as the night went on, the tone got a little more muted because there were some states, that were expected to go blue that weren't being called yet. There were some states that were called red, to our surprise, and people started clenching their fists and furiously typing their devices and calling their friends and asking what's going on, and then at a certain point, it it suddenly looked really bad. Like, there was no path to victory, or there was just one narrow path to victory, and people were just swearing, and it was just rage. A lot of women of Hillary's generation who had, worked with her in political things for decades were there, and they thought it was their turn, her turn, and their turn. And so it was a moment where it just seemed like there was a glitch in the simulation. Everyone there was so sure of their reality, and then CNN was showing a different reality. And so at a certain point, I felt like I had to leave. It was getting uncomfortable there, and so we wove my way out through all these rings of the event, and everyone was in a stupor. Everybody looked shocked. And then I couldn't find there's no subways in that area. I couldn't find a cab because of the crowd. So I like went on all the apps to get a car and walked a couple blocks. And then finally, the only thing that came up was an Uber pool, the Uber where you're sharing a ride. And I'm like, sure, anything, get me out of here. And so the car pulls up, and I get in the back, and there's a sort of middle-aged woman. I didn't know her, very formally dressed, silk dress, pearls. And she was so happy. She was smiling, and she's like, hello, good night. How are you doing? And then at a certain point, she says, did you come from the event? And I was like, yeah, at the Javits Center. And then she's like, no, at the Midtown Hilton. And then I realized that Donald Trump, who also lives in New York City, had his event, only a few blocks away, and that the car, perhaps Uber should have put a Chinese wall between those two addresses that night. But I was suddenly, sharing a ride with one of them, with someone from the Red tribe, and I just couldn't. My curiosity overcame me, and I said, "Were you surprised by the outcome?" And she said, "No, not at all, because he's been gaining support in the Midwest significantly over the last month, and there's a lot of people who are independents who don't like her, etc." These are just things I had not been hearing, I had not been aware of, and she seemed to have a very evidence-based view of the world, one that made her not surprised by the outcome. And we were sort of heading uptown, sharing a ride, but not sharing the same reality. And that to me was just one of those moments I'll never forget, because it showed me that these tribal forces, these ways in which culture can take over your mind, it wasn't just something I was studying in other people. It had completely taken a grip over me. I was part of the phenomenon. So that's when I started thinking that the book should be called Tribal, and that we should really think about the positive things that culture can do, as being part of the same, human machinery as the negative things that culture can do, and understanding how it works, either for good or for bad.
Right. You highlight in that story an interesting phenomena about tribes. Is that when I am a member of that tribe or of that in group, some people will like to say, I hear what they hear. I think much as they think. Don't listen to other sources of news, and you create your own little echo chamber in ways. And it exists, I think that phenomenon exists in all tribes, regardless whether they're political, work, community, and so on, which is the danger of the tribe.
One of the dangers, yes, but one of the ones that's most relevant to this political rift
Right.
that we're living
dealing
in.
with. That's right. Okay, so let's back up a little bit from an academic point of view. You make a big thing about this in the book, so just the quick summary through why do tribes exist?
Well, tribes are the human specific form of social organization. Like all of the primates, have different, social scales. Chimpanzees are closest to us, live in groups of 50 maximum. After that, there's no trust, and the group, it descends into bloodshed. Humans, early on in our evolution, started acquiring some adaptations for sharing knowledge in their groups, for sharing their adaptive learned behavior, eat the red berries, not the green berries, when there's a tsunami coming, head for the hills, just adaptive things. And the main way that we became wired to learn these things were various forms of imitation. So if I saw other members of my in-group doing X, I would say, well, all of is equal, I'm going to do X. It's probably a good heuristic for the right thing to do. And that when that started happening, then some learned knowledge would spread and become sort of common to a group. And then it started taking on more significance because it was a bonding thing. It helped us understand who was us and who was them, based on the way that we adorned ourselves or the kind of food that we ate. So there were a couple waves of this evolution over the Stone Age that I think produced different layers of our cultural psychology or our tribal instincts. And there are, positive things that we can do as a result of each of these layers. And there are dangers or fallibilities that come as a result of each layer.
Right. Well, I think if you look at history, it's pretty clear the human species would not have survived as a single individual. Like you need the community to have any number of the advances that we have had, from cultivation to child rearing to, safety to a whole bunch of things. Okay, so now, are they on the balance? Are tribes more good or more harmful?
Well, I'm definitely going to come down on the more good side of things. I think we notice tribalism more when it's leading to harmful outcomes. And we take it for granted when it's leading us to, hold an election successfully, or when it's leading us to, have a literature in a country that is a source of national pride, or when the legal system operates by precedent. All of these things are related to our tribal psychology. Almost everything that we do collectively, we do as a result of how we are empowered by our tribal psychology. So I think the times when it goes wrong are sort of, everything in evolution, whether it's like that we evolved to be attracted to sugar, right? So that can, in the modern environment, lead us to overeat and become obese, but it doesn't mean it's a bad thing that we are wired that way. We're wired that way because it ensured that our ancestors ate fruit and got vitamin C. So we can't expect any evolved system to work well 100% of the time. We have to hope for 90% of the time, and then learn to mitigate the problems by understanding what the system is like.
Okay, so in human society, I've always wanted to know the answer to this question from a scientist. So in human society, is there a maximum size of a tribe? Like you said in chimps, 50 is kind of about the maximum size. Is there a maximum size for humans?
Um, no, I don't think so. It when we Part of what makes tribal living different than living, say, in a chimpanzee troop or living in any other social form among primates is that the the group is bonded together by shared ideas. And in other primates, people are bonded either by being closely related to the other person or having established a direct personal bond, which primates do through grooming, through picking fleas off of each other. That's their main way of forming an interpersonal bond. But it's time consuming, and so the group can only grow so large if every individual has to be close to every other individual. But when we started to become bonded and to experience trust as a result of shared knowledge, then the circle of trust could expand beyond kith and kin, and even a total stranger could be a trusted in-group member because their behavior and their thoughts even were predictable to me. I could anticipate what they would do next. I could greet them with a greeting ritual that they would recognize, and then we're on our way to collaborating. So, over time, over human history, the size of our groups have increased exponentially, in part because of population increase. But, you can, depending on what you want to consider to be a community, nations are communities, international corporations are communities. You might think of social networks, like Facebook it's a very large, community, but these communities are over 1 billion people.
Okay. Right.
The
Okay.
community of
Okay.
Islam is 2 billion people. The community of Catholics about the same size.
Okay. All right. I get where you're going with this one. All right. So let's go back. In the book, you're arguing that there are three sources that really drive tribes, three instincts. Explain those to me and kind of give me a modern day example of what that looks like. How does it work?
Okay. Well, the first one, I named them all after a type of person in our life, because they're all, from the kind of social science that you and I studied, they called it reference groups. What are these groups that we look to as a basis of our norms, and then we use them as a guide. And so I argue that the sort of primal, reference group is peers. And in the earliest human times, we lived in bands, which were groups of 30, 40 people who slept and foraged together. And subsistence peoples today, hunter-gatherer people today, still have bands. And then at a certain point in our evolution, we started to have clans, which are a larger group, and then ultimately full-on tribes, where it went to thousands and then tens of thousands of people. So the peer instinct is what first enabled sort of coordinated activity like a hunting party or gathering systematically as a team. And then in the contemporary world, where the peer instinct shows up as our conformist impulses, and we often deride them. We think of them as irrational. They are irrational. They're not driven by calculations of cost and benefit. They're driven out of hardwired impulses to want to be in agreement with the people around us. It feels good. It's motivating to be in agreement. I think a generation or two ago, people's peer instinct played out in the ethnic neighborhoods they lived in the religious congregations that they would meet with, once a week, and feel this sense of common belief and all the validation and security that comes with that. One of the reasons why politics has changed in this country, I think, is with the waning of those like-minded communities that we used to have, the ethnic neighborhoods and the religious congregations. Most Americans now answer none on the survey about their religion, so we don't have that identity connection anymore. I think the red and the blue tribes became mega identities. They became identities that make that give people this sense of being understood and having their worldview reflected back at them, and knowing who their common people are. So that's, I think, part of what happened in our politics, that we've switched to thinking of our political parties, which I think a generation ago, you didn't know which of your colleagues were Republican and Democrat, right? A few people were zealots who wore T-shirts and planted lawn signs, but most people were, quiet about their politics. It came up, maybe once every 4 years, but it wasn't a defining identity. It didn't determine which restaurants you went to and which clothes you wear and what hobbies you do on the weekend. And now it's become that, the red and the blue tribe. They live in different parts of the country. They differ in age. They differ in gender on average. They differ in ethnicity on average. So it's become correlated with all these other identities. All of that is, I think, the peer instinct at work, either for good or for bad.
All right, so a peer instinct that is a fundamental drive for us as human beings to want to belong, to be part of, and we create a group around us that we imitate, that perpetuates the tribe. And as you just rightly described vis-a-vis politics in the US, that tribal identity can shift over time as well. All right, so that's peer instincts. What's the second instinct?
Well, if the peer instinct is the drive to be normal and to be understood and to have a common worldview, the hero instinct is the drive to be normative, to uphold the standards of the group, and to be recognized as an exemplary contributor to the group. And this is something that started showing up about 500,000 years ago in the archaeological record. Suddenly you had shelters that people had built from scratch as opposed to just a cave. Suddenly you had the skeletons of people with congenital deformities that survived to the age of adulthood. Well, what is that? What do these things tell us? It tells us that people were taking care of others, even people who couldn't directly repay the favor. People were contributing in a pro-social way. It's at the same time that humans moved to the top of the food chain. They were hunting rhinoceroses and woolly mammoths and giant animals like that, where you need to get beyond the free rider problem, you need one courageous hunter to strike the glancing blow. And when we discover, as the Arctic steppe recedes, and we discover mammoths in the ice, some of them have, spear points, right in their face, which shows that a really courageous hunter, was taking one for the team. Not just being part of the team, but taking one for the team, taking a personal risk. And why did that evolve? Well, what the evolutionary theorists say is that so long as the species had a sense of reputation, so long as they had a sense of status, that like this person is a pro-social contributor and this person is kind of lazy, as long as those judgments were being made and that gossip was being spread, then it paid off for people to do these pro-social things, even at personal cost, because there were rewards that came to those with a high reputation. Just like when you have a high credit rating, you get access to opportunities you wouldn't otherwise have access to. People who built this standing in the community were rewarded with mating opportunities, with resources that helped them and their children survive. So that is why, it's a puzzle. It was a puzzle for a lot of evolutionary theorists early on of how did altruism ever evolve? Because evolution is about, it's not about survival of the nicest, it's survival of the fittest. But it's because the community rewards the altruists in the long run that altruism, pays off. So that's the hero instinct. And today it shows up in, you can't run an organization just by having incentive systems, you have to rely on people's desire to contribute, desire to go beyond expected, extra role contributions. And you can't create that in people, but it's already in them. If a community dominates a lot of their life, they want to be they want to be respected in that community. And that's probably the strongest motivation a manager can work with. It's like giving people opportunities to show their peers that they're a contributor and that they're helping the whole place run. And so we can, just like we can deride conformity, we can deride status seeking. But I think we should recognize status seeking is a somewhat irrational force that sometimes leads to silly behavior, but it's the engine of innovation and it's the engine of pro-social contributions. And it allowed for cooperation at a much broader scale than when people were just conformist.
It strikes me, Michael, listening to you talk about this, that, one of the kind of current hot things going is making sure that leaders are conscious of their values and how those values are driving their decisions so that it's a thoughtful, intentional process, not an accidental one. And it seems to me, as somebody who coaches leaders, that having them look at their heroes. So who have you looked to in the past and want to emulate? Who do you see as the ideal leader, the ideal personality, or whatever contributor? That would be a really good way of saying what's in my head about what I think I should be doing and how I should be doing. I just think it's that powerful in people's lives.
Yeah, I think that's one thing. As no matter how rational and educated we are, we are wired to look to heroes with a notion of trying to emulate them, and it's why we read newspaper articles about LeBron James and why we want to know what Donald Trump eats for breakfast. We have this curiosity about what the high status people do, and we selectively emulate it. As for me personally, yeah, I can recognize that in my life, and I've I've learned to not inhibit it, right? So when I was young, I had a lot of authority issues, like a lot of people, a lot of Americans do, and I thought, anyone who was successful must be a sellout, and anyone who is rich must be greedy, etc. But I kind of have gotten beyond that through understanding that this desire to emulate success and status is part of what makes any community run. Even an artistic community or even a community of political activists. They also have to have heroes and they have to emulate their heroes in order for everything to run. So I could tell you my heroes as a writer, and I could tell you my heroes, within my community at Columbia Business School, but I don't know if we want to get into
I'll skip that personal psychology on this particular moment, Michael. All right. So let me repeat where we are. We got one more instinct to go. So the notion is that tribes have existed forever. They're kind of a baked in evolutionary success factor for human beings. And we are instinctively driven to belong to a community. Call it a tribe, okay, of varying sizes. The instincts that push us towards being a part of that tribe are emulating our peers, wanting to fit in, to be a part of, to seem to be belonging, and to kind of feel like you're normal in some way to that community. Granted, there are multiple different communities, and they may not be as similar to each other, but that I want to fit into that community. And within a community, we have heroes, people who have contributed above and beyond others that we try to emulate. Or we try to be the hero of the community because we want to show to people that we're making an outsized contribution. Okay, so peers, heroes, and what's the third factor that drives tribes?
Well, the third instinct is the one that might sound like the most irrational of all, but it really was the crowning touch in our evolutionary, blessing of tribal psychology. And this is what I call the ancestor instinct. And it came only in the last 100,000 years. And it's in our current life, it's why we hang on the words of the elders, at their retirement party to try to understand what the organization was like in the old days, or when we read stories about the founder, whether it's Thomas Watson at IBM or, Bill Gates at Microsoft, and we think that, these original intentions of the founder, just like we think about the founding fathers of the country and what was their intention in writing the Constitution. We have this curiosity and almost this ability to learn by rote when the prior generation is speaking, or when we uncover artifacts from the prior generation, whether it's collecting antiques or art, or for early humans, it was discovering cave paintings that, had been done by people of previous generations. And what is really interesting in cave painting is that when they carbon date the paintings in a given cave, they discover that in many of the caves, like throughout France, the 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 paintings look like a mural. There's drawings of lots of animals in the same style, charcoal drawings, outline drawings. But when they carbon date it, they realize that these drawings were done thousands of years apart, meaning that people in an area would learn about the cave, go to the cave. A lot of these caves get sealed off and then opened up again when there are rock slides. They would go to the cave, and then they would see these mysterious images of frightening animals on the wall, and they didn't behave like Hollywood cavemen behave, with rolling a rock in front of the cave, or scribbling out the paintings. They behaved with reverence. They studied the paintings, even though these were not paintings that everyone could see because they were in these remote, hard to access caves. But in a very ritualistic way, they studied the drawings. They learned how to replicate them, and then they extended the work of their very distant ancestors. And I think that compulsion to keep alive the ways of the collective past, the ancestral ways, can lead to a lot of irrational behavior, like a lot of stubborn traditionalism. But I think it was adaptive because it produced tribal memory. Before that, there might be an innovation like stone point spears, or woven baskets or something. But then if a group, maybe had a catastrophe like an epidemic or something like that, and you suddenly lose a lot of the elders, you might lose this knowledge. And then there's nobody who knows how to make the stone point spears anymore. There's nobody who knows how to weave the baskets. And in the archaeological record, you'd see that. You'd see from fossils, you would see that a group, had a technology for 20 generations, and then lost it for 50 generations, and then got it again, and then lost it again. So a lot of their hero instinct energy was going into reinventing the wheel. But once they had this ancestor instinct compulsion, they weren't forgetting. There wasn't this tribe level forgetting that used to happen. And then when all three of these things were in place, what started is what anthropologists call cumulative cultural evolution, where each generation, the shared expertise in a group, the shared culture would become sort of richer and richer over time, because they weren't backsliding, they were just adding, they were just building on the wisdom of the past each generation. And then without individuals becoming any brainier, our brains stopped expanding a long time ago, but individuals became more capable of surviving and thriving because they could tap in to all this inherited knowledge. And that's why I think it's, we're called Homo sapiens. Sapiens refers to knowledge. That knowledge, shared knowledge, is sort of the killer app of our humankind. It's what makes us different. It's not our rationality. When they design cognitive tests to compare, just the basic, spatial reasoning of a chimpanzee and the spatial reasoning of a human, we're not very different. But it's this inherited knowledge capacity, sharing knowledge in groups, inheriting knowledge in groups, and all the abilities to collaborate, that come with it. That's what distinguishes us from the other animals.
It's very interesting. So, when you talk about the ancestors and the reverence for the ancestors, it reminds me of the rituals that we do and the stories that we tell. Because, in many ways, those stories are what bind us together as a troop. It's another way of going back and reinforcing I am part of this. And it's a way of telling what is the peer norm here, and it's a way of telling who are our heroes. It's like those that all comes together to kind of fit into creating a great tribal bond.
Yes. I mean, stories are otherwise known as myths. And, myths and rituals are both traditions that we learn in a slightly different way than we learn other things. Because with myths and rituals, there's kind of this insistence on replicating it exactly the way that you learned it. So when you're repeating a myth, you can't ad lib, right? You're supposed to tell it exactly the same way. And if the parent tells the myth wrong to the child, the grandparent will interrupt and say, no, 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 that's not how it happened. Like this, get it right, get it right. Similarly with the ritual, if you're holding a Seder dinner and somebody wants to do something out of order, it's like, no, 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 no. We first do this, then we do this, then we do that. And a lot of the meaning, the sense of meaning that comes with myths and rituals comes from that sort of rigid replication, knowing that you're doing something exactly the same way that your grandparents and their grandparents did, or your mentor did, and his or her mentor did.
Okay. So then we have the ancestral kind of the myths and rituals, but we also have the ability to add to that knowledge with reverence and respect. That's the shared knowledge. Okay, so three instincts that keep us bonded together. The peer emulation, do what other people around me are doing. That gives me a sense of belonging. The heroes, I either want to be a hero or I'm emulating the heroes of our group. And the shared knowledge.
The ancestor instinct, yeah, and the idea to keep alive the ways of the past generation.
All right, so now if I take those three instincts, peers, heroes, and ancestors, how do I start to use those three inside a corporation to change the culture? Just give me an example of how this could work.
Well, I think that's a great question, and as I understand, the premise of out of the comfort zone, is the idea that a lot of people who become leaders in corporations, they may be like the best engineer in their business unit, and now they're promoted to running, this executive senior vice president position, and they've relied on their technical expertise and solving problems rationally, and now they're solving human problems, and there's no formula, and so part of it, I think, is trusting instincts, even though they're irrational, as things that do generally work to constructive ends. So when I coach executives in some of our executive education programs, a lot of what I think I'm doing is I'll have a person who maybe is the engineer, or maybe they're the financial guy in a Wall Street firm and they're comfortable with the numbers, but now they have to like tell a story that is going to create a sense of camaraderie, in a group, and so I tell them, well, what you want to do is you want to tell a story about some formative experience you had and how that shaped or informed the values that you're bringing to work. And they look at me with panic. They're like, I'm not a minister. I don't have stories about my life. I don't know what my values are. But then, you kind of say, well, I think you do. You're not used to talking about them at work, but I think if you were talking to your kids, you probably would tell stories about growing up, and you would explain why this story underscores the need for, collaboration, or the need for compliance, or whatever it is that the organization is struggling with. So I think it's getting people to be comfortable in these roles as as somebody who's a- fomenting the force of conformity to get people to go with the program, or um, al- allowing themselves to become a role model for other people, or choosing. Sometimes the CEO can't be the role model because the value that you're trying to promote is questioning authority. And so in that case, in an organization that's trying for that kind of creativity, the CEO would do better to, pick a low level employee who's done something innovative and give that person a platform, put them on stage, give them a TED talk, have their story make them a relatable hero for other people. And then even, allow yourself to engage in myth making. If you have a new plan or a new platform or a new strategy for the organization, study the history of the organization and find some suitable chapter of the past that resembles the thing that you want to do now, and tell people the story of that. And then the thing that you're asking them to do won't seem like some risky new thing. It'll seem like an established thing, a part of the identity, part of the DNA of the firm. And so, being comfortable engaging in myth making, being comfortable being a role model or setting up role models, and being comfortable with conformity, even though these things are irrational, I think is what a lot of emerging leaders, have to learn.
I often see and believe that the peer piece is a piece we way underestimate. So if I'm trying to get something accepted, new project, new budget, whatever, I want to get it accepted. I contend if you're the only one who thinks it, you're dead in the water. But if you can find a peer set, and it's surprisingly small peer set, who have some standing in some group, who are on board and who can become promoters of the idea with you, that suddenly it has an outsized voice and an outsized impact. But what you've just said to me is that phenomena that I observed is the peer instinct in tribes. So if these 5 people are behind it, then okay, it's worthy of consideration. I'll go along. And as you rightly said, finding a hero who's done this or who's done something similar to it and promoting that makes it feel like, oh, well, if they can do it, then so can I. And I've certainly seen a couple of times recently where people say, I know what I'm asking you to do is unusual, but we've done this before. Let's go back to
There's comfort in that, right?
1897 when
Yeah.
yada, yada, yada. And they tell the story that we've done this before. We've been here before. So I think all of those really do show up. We just haven't stopped to say, where are they and how are they showing up?
Exactly. I mean, it's being comfortable with tribal forces, being a tribal chief, being a tribal shaman. Yeah, these are very irrational roles, for the rational, overeducated people. They can be quite uncomfortable, but I think in some ways that's the transition, when you're teaching people to move into the C-suite, is getting them comfortable with the sort of political side and the executive side and the political side of the job, which is really different from the more expertise-based technical skills that
That's right.
get them there.
That's right. I always contend the move into those very top organizations in politics is really an understanding of how you're influencing people to go in the direction you want them to do. And what you're telling me is another set of tools for how to influence. All right, I got to ask one last question because there are a lot of people, I presume, listening to this who say, yes, but my problem has always been I've never been part of the tribe. I may have another small tribe over here, but it's small and not particularly powerful. But there's this big, massively powerful tribe that I don't participate in, and I really resent it. What's your advice to those people who feel outside the dominant group?
Otherwise known as the tribe that doesn't think it's part of a tribe, the
Yes.
tribe, the community. I was one of those people. I'm a convert, to the Church of Tribalism. I was a hyper individualistic person, always worried about, oh, if I'm too central to the people on the track team, I'll just become an idiot, so I have to kind of hang at the periphery. And if I'm too gung-ho at my university, then I'll be kind of silly. So I have to be sort of a critic. But I think those people are serving, those people who are peripheral members of groups, serve the group in an important way. They are often the conduit for a group to learn or borrow ideas from a neighboring group. We sometimes call them boundary spanners, and in a network researchers, they would say that, when you to have a social network as an executive that's really effective, you sort of need to have your allies. You need people to be your posse, bring them to a meeting so that you have a base of support, and then other people will join the bandwagon, right? But then you also need your antennae. You need people who you maybe are not as close to, but they're connected to lots of other people that you don't know, and they're your pipelines. They bring knowledge and opportunity to you that you wouldn't otherwise get. So I think that people who feel like, they're not one of the popular kids, they're not one of the joiners, they're not one of the conformists, well, you're playing an essential role in the community through being the peripheral member, the boundary spanning member. So you shouldn't feel like you're left out of this whole game.
It's interesting. I also think you didn't say it directly, but it seems to me that you could say, let's gather together various people who feel like they're on the periphery, because together we might have more influence on this other thing that we're not really wanting to be a part of or not really invited to be part of. Okay.
Yeah. All right. You look at places like the tech industry, it's a community largely of people who were the outcasts of their high school, but now have, extreme wealth and status, so there's some bonding that can come from, I think, geek culture is kind of that way, that it's like, we're not the jocks, right? We're the geeks, but then it's a new identity that,
right. And they grows importance and became more significant with time. All right. My guest today, Michael Morris. The book we're talking about is Tribal: How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Bring Us Together. 3 cultural instincts: emulating the peers around you so you belong and fit in some capacity, finding heroes and wanting to be a hero and emulating those heroes, and then the ancestors, the shared knowledge, the myths and rituals of the past, and how those inform. Those are what bond us together as tribes. There are also the things that help us change cultures and persuade people to move in a different direction, if you stop to think about it and figure out how to actually use them on the way. All right, so Michael, if somebody wanted to find you, what's the best way to reach out to you?
I have a website for the book that is, you can get it as tribal.book or michaelwmorris.com. They both bring you there. And the book there's an audio book that I recorded, there's a Kindle version, and so however you like to consume your books, there's a version for you. And I really like to hear from my readers, so if anybody has questions for me, I really love to engage and hear how the book is showing up in your life.
Okay. Love it. We love to hear from you too. So head to Out of the Comfort Zone, send us a comment. Love to hear what your questions are, what you'd like us to talk about, what your comments are about this particular episode. In addition, you can also watch this on our YouTube channel at Out of the Comfort Pod. And you'll get there some additional materials, like some short clips if you want to just see a bite of the podcast along the way. And join us next week for another episode in Getting Out of Your Comfort Zone.
Thank you for joining us today. Tune in for another edition next week with Dr. Wanda Wallace on the Voice America Business Channel. Reach outside your comfort zone this week.